For 3 decades, a chilling mystery has festered on the east coast of Ireland. More than 10 disappearances and murders of young women have gone underpublicized and unsolved. Women who vanished from bus stops, sidewalks, and driveways, seemingly without a trace. Many have never been recovered. Similarities in victimology and location led investigators to theorize about one or more serial killers. The hunting ground became known as the Vanishing Triangle, and while renewed interest has unearthed new evidence, these cases remain unsolved. Within the green vales and rolling hills of the Emerald Isle, a dark secret remains. What happened to the women within the Vanishing Triangle, and who was responsible for their disappearances? The cases officially attributed to the Vanishing Triangle began in 1993 and continued through the decade. However, many have speculated about earlier cases that share similar methodology, geography, and victimology, stretching as far back as the late 1970s. The following cases have speculative connection to the official disappearances, and they are profiled here with the hopes of providing a more comprehensive picture of the culture, the country, and the unidentified criminal or criminals responsible. 23-year-old Phyllis Murphy was shopping for presents a few days ahead of Christmas in 1979. She was a factory worker at Crerar knitwear, and that night she was shopping for gifts for her 9 brothers and sisters. She was last seen at a bus stop in Newbridge, 40 minutes southwest of Dublin. She was reported missing later that night when she failed to meet her friend to attend a dance party. It was one of the coldest winters in Kildare County. In spite of the cold, over 3,000 locals volunteered to participate in the search effort. Some of the gifts she had been carrying were later located in a nearby plain. On New Year's Day, Murphy was recovered off the Sally Gap, a small 2-lane road that cuts through the rolling scenery of the Wicklow Mountains. While the frigid temperatures and snow had hindered search efforts, they had also preserved soft tissue and DNA evidence. Her injuries indicated an assault, attack, and strangulation. Her body had been stripped, and she had over 25 bruises and abrasions on her upper torso. Despite media attention and thorough investigation, the case ran cold and stayed cold for 23 years. In 2002, a cold case investigator ran DNA from the scene against samples that had been willingly taken from local men. This led to the eventual arrest and conviction of former Army Sergeant John Crerar. Crerar's potential involvement in additional disappearances will be discussed later. Justice may have been found on behalf of Phyllis Murphy, but she was just the first of many cases unofficially connected to the Vanishing Triangle. Antoinette Smith was a 27-year-old mother of 2. She had arranged for her 2 children to stay the night with her ex-husband Carl Smith while she attended a David Bowie concert on July 12, 1987. She went with a friend, and afterward the 2 took a bus to Dublin and arrived around 11 p.m. They met 2 male friends at a local dance club, and the 4 stayed until just after 2 a.m. Outside the club, Smith and her friend had a small spat. Before leaving, the friend offered a key to her apartment so Smith could stay over. The 2 men left shortly after, hailing a cab nearby. They watched Smith walk in the direction of the O'Connell Bridge, dressed in blue jeans and a Bowie shirt she had purchased from the concert. This was the last time she would be seen alive. A few days later, Carl Smith reported her missing to officials. Despite the media attention and high-profile investigation, officials failed to turn up any leads. On April 3, 1988, a young family discovered Smith's remains in the Wicklow Mountains. The area was isolated, and prolonged exposure had eliminated most of the evidence. The medical examiner believes that Smith likely passed due to asphyxiation, as she had been recovered with 2 plastic bags over her head. She was identified by her deteriorating Bowie shirt and a metal key in her pocket that matched the lock of her friend's apartment. Upon the discovery of her remains, the case received renewed media attention, and with the extra exposure, a taxi driver came forward as the first witness. He recounted that he was hailed down by 2 men and a woman in a Bowie shirt near the O'Connell Bridge around the time of her disappearance. He overheard the 3 passengers discuss meeting at a fast food restaurant, and they planned to attend a house party in the foothills of the Wicklow Mountains. A second witness came forward who described walking his dogs on the morning of July 12th, just 2 miles away from where Smith's remains were recovered. He encountered a man descending the path who appeared to be wearing dark clothes that were not suitable for the area or the weather. The unidentified man passed the witness and met with a second in the car park. The witness described feeling uneasy before retreating to his vehicle and leaving the area. Both witnesses described the suspects as men in their early 20s. One was talkative with a thin face and hair parted in the middle. The other was a taller man who was quiet. No additional information has been released to the public. 4 years after the disappearance of Antoinette Smith, on December 23, 1991, Patricia Doherty vanished. She was a prison officer and mother of 2, preparing for Christmas just a few days in advance. She got her hair cut, purchased gifts at a nearby shopping center, and returned home in South Dublin shortly before 9 p.m. However, upon returning home, she realized she had forgotten one small thing: Santa hats for her children to wear during the holiday season. She left home, headed for the same shopping center, only she never returned. Her husband, Patrick, didn't report her missing until Christmas Day, thinking that she had been called in to work. During the investigation, one witness reported seeing Doherty in the parking lot outside her intended destination. A second witness with a criminal background reported that Doherty entered a red vehicle outside of Bridget Burke's pub, which shared a parking lot with the nearby shopping center. Her husband made appeals on radio programs, urging anyone to come forward with additional information. During this time, he claimed to receive several phone calls at his home, the caller remaining eerily silent until finally disconnecting. Doherty remained missing until the summer of 1992. A groundskeeper cutting turf in the Wicklow Mountains unearthed a hand and forearm less than a mile from where Antoinette Smith's remains had been recovered. A search of the surrounding bog uncovered some of Doherty's possessions, including the golden headscarf she had worn that night. The medical examiner identified Doherty through dental records, personal effects, and her house key, which remained on the body. It was determined that she had been strangled. No suspects have ever been named in this case. Some believed these cases were unconnected, only coincidentally sharing some similarities. They theorized that these crimes against women simply went under-investigated as a result of the social and political climate of Ireland at the time, and a fearful public was drawing connections where there were none. Others were terrified that the same perpetrator or perpetrators had committed these crimes, that they were still free, stalking the countryside for their next victim. In 1993, these fears were catapulted to an international stage with the disappearance of an American woman from Dublin, marking the official beginning of the Vanishing Triangle. On the morning of March 26, 1993, Annie McCarrick was knitting in her apartment in Sandymount, a coastal suburb of Dublin. Her two housemates left to spend time in their countryside homes before midday, and McCarrick was alone. She was originally from Long Island, studying abroad in Ireland in the late 1980s, and she had decided to move there permanently in early 1993. She was 26 years old, a waitress at a local restaurant, and she was planning on becoming a teacher. She had plans to hike with a friend in the Wicklow Mountains that weekend. However, her friend had injured her leg and canceled last minute. McCarrick left to run errands around 11 a.m., stopping at her bank before purchasing groceries. She returned home at 3 p.m., but she was spotted leaving her home shortly after at 3:15. When her housemates returned, they found that she had not unpacked her groceries, which was unusual behavior for McCarrick. She was seen shortly after by a local fast food shop owner, headed toward the bus stop at New Grove Avenue. There, she took the number 18 bus, transferred to the number 44, which would take her to the foothills of the Wicklow Mountains. She was seen waiting at the bus stop for the number 44 bus by a former coworker. According to the bus routes, McCarrick would have arrived at Enniskerry, just outside the Wicklow Mountains at 5 p.m., which was late for a countryside hike. Strangely, there was no surveillance footage of McCarrick in the area. However, a security guard at Johnny Fox's pub claimed that he saw McCarrick enter the pub with a man who was 5'9" in his mid to late 20s. He claimed the man was athletic with dark hair and he was wearing a wax jacket. Another security guard at Johnny Fox's also claimed to have seen McCarrick the night of her disappearance. Johnny Fox's was almost 4 miles from her bus stop. This would have been a long walk for McCarrick. Some of her friends arrived at her apartment on Saturday for a planned dinner, but she was nowhere to be found. Her mother arrived on March 30th for a planned trip. When she discovered that her daughter had not been seen for several days, she reported McCarrick missing to the authorities. Investigators believe that McCarrick was at the Johnny Fox's pub. In 2008, they publicly announced they had investigated 2 suspects who were local residents. These men were never publicly named and they have no criminal background. One of the central investigators proposed an alternative theory in recent years. With solid intelligence, this investigator believes a former IRA member was in the area at the time and he was believed to be at Johnny Fox's pub. The investigator theorizes that the IRA member tried to impress McCarrick with tales of his exploits. When he drunkenly overindulged, he eliminated McCarrick to cover his tracks and then called his former handlers to cover up the evidence. The disappearance of Annie McCarrick remains an open investigation. No additional information has been released to the public. Ava Brennan vanished just 3 short months after the disappearance of Annie McCarrick. She was a 39-year-old woman who lived in the South Dublin suburb of Rathgar, and she came from a local family with 7 other siblings. It was Sunday, July 25, 1993, when Brennan walked to her parents' home after attending Mass at a local church. She visited her family almost every day, and on that day she had had a small argument with a sibling, which resulted in her leaving before dinner was served. This was the last time that Brennan was seen. The route home included several busy roads rife with pubs and restaurants. Her father, Davy, was a local business owner, and the Brennan family was well known within the community. However, there were no confirmed sightings of Brennan along this route. Her family didn't hear from her Monday or Tuesday, and when her father called, he received no answer. He broke into her apartment and noted that everything looked untouched. He reported her missing that evening. Initially, investigators took her father's report to mean that Brennan had not returned home after the argument with her parents. In addition, they could not find her purse or car keys in the apartment. The family later found the coat she had been wearing in the closet. which suggested Brennan had returned to her home before leaving again. The family reported that investigators seemed unconcerned by Brennan's disappearance. At first, officials told her family that they believed no crime had occurred. When they were told of Brennan's recurring depression, they proposed that she had disappeared of her own volition. Her father was a connected man who urged authorities through all channels, and after a month, investigators seemed to be taking Brennan's disappearance seriously. They conducted a forensic analysis of her home, but family members had cleaned and tidied the apartment since her disappearance. As a result, no new evidence was uncovered, and no new information has been released. Less than 6 months later, Imelda Keenan disappeared 2 hours south of Dublin in Waterford City. She was a 28-year-old woman who lived with her partner, Mark Wall. She had 9 siblings, and she was studying computer science at the Central Technical Institute. She had plans to go home for Christmas, catching a train with her brother Ned on December 23rd. She canceled last minute and told him that she would catch a later train. Keenan did not like traveling alone, and she never arrived home for Christmas. On January 3rd, she was celebrating the prolonged academic holiday between Christmas and New Year's. After 1 p.m., she left her apartment to collect a welfare check from the post office and never returned. Again, investigators failed to forensically analyze the apartment. One of the detectives would later write about the case in his book, claiming that her partner didn't report her missing and told police that she had said she was very depressed before leaving the house. Her family had searched the apartment and found her glasses, cigarettes, handbag, and unopened Christmas presents. An unconfirmed witness sighting from a secretary claims to have seen Keenan rounding the corner onto Lombard Street near Tower Hotel. No additional information has been released. Her family has constructed a memorial plaque at this corner to keep her memory alive. Jo Dullard grew up in Callan. She moved to Dublin to study at a beautician school, and she waitressed to make ends meet. However, she found she was short on time and money. She dropped out and began waitressing full-time for a few years before moving back to Callan with a friend. On November 9th, she took a bus back to Dublin to pick up a social welfare check from a post office, just 3 miles from where Annie McCarrick vanished. She collected her check, but she was stranded in the city until 6 p.m. when the returning bus to Kilkenny departed. She visited Bruxelles Pub, a favorite haunt of hers, hoping to run into friends. There, she encountered her ex-boyfriend at 2:30 p.m., and the two breathed life into their old flame. Dullard had planned to stay the night with her ex, but his current girlfriend found the two and an argument broke out. The couple left shortly after, and Dullard found herself stranded in Dublin as her 6 p.m. bus had already departed. Rather than stay the night with friends, she took a bus to the town of Naas, still 65 miles away from Callan, her intended destination. It was the only one headed in her direction, and she arrived around 10 p.m. The bus driver stated that he had to wake her at the end of the line, and the town itself had already shuttered up for the night. From here, she hitchhiked. She was first picked up by an elderly man, then a younger one. However, she had only traveled as far as Moon, still 40 miles away from her home. She stopped at a phone booth and called her friend Mary Cullinane while still attempting to hitch a ride. On the phone, she told her friend about her hitchhiking route and the day's events. She cut the call short, claiming a driver had stopped. This call would be the last confirmed contact with Jo Dullard. The next day, her manager called Dullard's mother at 6 p.m., reporting that she hadn't arrived for her shift. That evening, her mother reported her missing. On Saturday, the family had a locksmith open the doors to her apartment and bedroom. They uncovered no missing clothes or possessions. Little came from the initial investigation. The family claims that investigators disparaged Dullard's character, claiming she was drinking, using drugs, and promiscuous. Officials attempted to tarnish her reputation to dampen public scrutiny and media attention. In 1996, a senior investigator visited the family off the record and claimed that some officials knew the details of her murder and the disposal of her body. Several eyewitnesses came forward, but their reports could not be confirmed. A woman from Moon claimed to have seen Dullard exiting the phone booth and entering a dark-colored four-door Toyota Carina. Dullard entered through the rear door, sitting in the back seat, which implied that the vehicle already had a second passenger. 4 miles south of Moon, a man in the village of Castledermot claimed to have seen a woman matching Dullard's description walking on the main street close to midnight. In 1994, a taxi driver came forward with an additional testimony. He had been driving 60 miles south of Moon outside ᴘᴘᴏᴀᴏ when he claimed to have spotted a red Ford Sierra on the side of the road. He saw a woman bolt from the rear seat of the vehicle, running barefoot into the street. He said the woman appeared to be trying to escape. A second man emerged from the vehicle and pulled the woman back into the car with the help of the driver. In 2020, Dullard's disappearance was reclassified as a murder. Cold case investigators made renewed efforts, attempting to loosen any new information. They shared that Dullard had a Sanyo cassette player with her at the time of her disappearance, and they petitioned the public for any sighting in 1995. In 2021, her family held a Christian memorial service and burial, imparting their final goodbyes. About 60 miles to the west of Dublin, Fiona Pender worked as a hairdresser and model in Tullamore. She was 25 years old, sharing an apartment with her partner, John Thompson. They had lived in London and only just moved back to Ireland a year earlier. In the summer of 1996, she was an expecting mother 7 months into term with her first child. On August 22nd, she went shopping for baby clothes with her mother before returning to her childhood home. She visited with her family, talking with her father about an upcoming fishing trip, and around 7 p.m. she was ready to get home. She took a taxi, accompanied by her mother, and the two said goodbye outside Pender's apartment. On August 23rd, her mother returned for a planned visit. When she saw the blinds were pulled, she suspected Pender might be resting and decided to leave. Later that day, her father walked by the apartment and saw the blinds were still closed and the lights were off. Both of her parents returned the next day, and their knocking and phone calls went unanswered. They called her partner, who had traveled to his family farm less than 10 miles away. He had stayed there overnight, and the last time he had seen Pender was the morning of the 22nd. Her brother, mother, and partner reported Pender missing, but she had already been gone for more than 2 days. They entered the home and found the baby clothes and bags still neatly folded inside. Local rivers and reservoirs were searched, and on August 27th, her disappearance was widely circulated on radio and television. Investigators believed that the person or persons responsible knew Pender. In 1997, they interviewed 5 relatives, but this turned up no additional leads. On May 10, 2008, a person hiking in a remote part of the Wicklow Mountains stumbled on a wooden cross, which read Fiona Pender, buried here Thursday, August 22, 1996. However, a search and excavation of the area turned up no evidence. In 2014, a witness reported having an argument with an Irishman in the United States who implied that he was responsible for Pender's disappearance, and officials excavated the area outside Tullamore. Her family believed this tip was credible and hoped her body would finally be recovered. However, the search was fruitless. Less than 6 months later, Ciara Breen disappeared an hour north of Dublin in the town of Dundalk. On February 13, 1997, Breen was just 17 years old. She had spent the day with her mother, dining at a local cafe before returning home for dinner. Her mother was due to receive biopsy results, and the two were anxious about the outcome. They spoke briefly that night before turning in for bed around midnight. A few hours later, her mother woke and found the window open with Breen missing. It's believed that she left of her own accord, and she was wearing a black leather jacket, jeans, sweatshirt, and white t-shirt. Breen was rebellious, and her mother believed she would return before sunrise. She never did. There were very few leads for investigators to follow. There were some potential sightings in Warren Point and Kilkeel, but none were confirmed. In 2015, investigators arrested a man in his 50s, Liam Mullen. He lived in the area at the time of the disappearance, and he is known to have had contact with Breen. However, he was released without charges. Then, Mullen was arrested a second time based on sightings of him with Breen on the night of her disappearance and comments he made regarding her body being dumped in a local bog. The marshland off RD Road was searched by officials, but again, they recovered no evidence of Breen. Mullen died in 2017 of an overdose while in police custody. Investigators believed his confession was their best hope for finally resolving Breen's disappearance. No additional information has been released. Fiona Sinnott was a 19-year-old mother with an 11-month-old baby girl. On February 9, 1998, just less than a year after the disappearance of Ciara Breen, Sinnott vanished after leaving her favorite pub, Butler's of Broadway, in Ballyhit, less than 2 hours south of Dublin. Sinnott was drinking with friends from around 5 p.m. to just after midnight. She told her friends that she was having a pain in her arm. Strangely, her former partner and father of her child, Sean Carroll, was in the pub that night drinking at the bar, although he was not with Sinnott and her friends. A little after midnight, she left the pub joined by Carroll, and the two walked to her nearby rented home, Sinnott still complaining of a pain in her arm. She went to sleep shortly after their return, and Carroll stayed the night on the couch. When she woke the next morning, she was still in pain and had plans to go to the doctor's office later that day. Carroll left for his family home, returning later to check on Sinnott, only to find her missing. She was quickly reported missing, and investigators conducted a search of her apartment, finding the majority of her possessions were missing. They claimed it looked as though Sinnott and her daughter never lived there at all. A neighbor claimed to have seen black trash bags outside the apartment, and a nearby farmer found trash bags containing clothing with Sinnott's name on his property. He burned the clothes thinking they were the result of illegal dumping. Several tips have been shared with family members and investigators, launching dig teams to several sites, one as recent as 2020. Officials were especially hopeful about a nearby field where fresh cement was poured around the time of her disappearance. Tragically, these digs turned up no additional evidence, and the disappearance of Fiona Sinnott has since gone cold. Deirdre Jacob was 18 years old at the time of her disappearance. She lived in Newbridge, where Phyllis Murphy was last seen waiting for her bus in 1979. At the time, Jacob was training to become a teacher at St. Mary's College, and she was spending a summer in Ireland. On July 28th, she planned to visit her grandmother and stop by the bank. She had to post a check in the mail that day to secure her accommodations in London for her second year of college. Investigators would later collect CCTV footage that captured Jacob on her route in Newbridge. She returned to her grandmother's to say goodbye and left Newbridge on foot around 2:30 p.m. Little is known about the route she may have taken, following Main Street or cutting through side streets. However, around 3:30 p.m. she was spotted by passing motorists on Barrettstown Road, which was less than 10 minutes from her destination. 8 confirmed sightings place her there, 6 of which were from witnesses who knew Jacob personally. The last witness to see her was a passing motorist, who identified her at the driveway of her home. Her mother returned that evening and found the doors locked with no sign of Jacob. She was reported missing that night. Investigators managed to retrace her steps, but they uncovered no additional clues or leads on what may have happened to her that afternoon. Her disappearance was upgraded to a murder in 2018. Cold case investigators attempted to enhance the pixelated CCTV footage to identify a man who was seen outside the post office while Jacob was in the area. They believed the man was Larry Murphy, but the enhanced footage was inconclusive. Larry Murphy will be discussed later in this video. There have been no additional developments in the murder investigation of Deirdre Jacob. Claire Boylan was a 36-year-old who lived with her parents in the South Dublin suburb of Terenure, the same neighborhood where Ava Brennan attended church before her disappearance. Boylan had 5 siblings, and she was the manager of a local bookstore. Her family claims that she was feeling tired and run down at the time of her disappearance. On March 2, 2003, Boylan left her home to meet a friend from school. Her trip would have been 60+ miles. However, her friend reported that Boylan never arrived for their meeting. On March 4th, she didn't show up for her shift at the bookstore. Her brother reported her missing. Several witnesses claimed to have seen her in her suburban neighborhood. Her family was hopeful she might reappear, but the unconfirmed sighting stopped just a few weeks after her disappearance. Family members and officials determined that no personal effects were missing from her room. Her luggage and passport were easily found, and investigators determined that she had not used her bank cards since her reported disappearance. One reporter, Gareth O'Callaghan, who investigated the disappearance of a young boy, Philip Cairns, stumbled upon a strange connection to the disappearances of Claire Boylan and Ava Brennan. He was reporting on a ring of predators in the area who were powerful and depraved men, and he claimed that an anonymous source named one man as having stalked Boylan and Brennan before their disappearances. However, there are no additional sources confirming this implication, and no additional information has been released about the disappearance of Claire Boylan. In 1998, the media attention drove the public to believe these cases may be connected, and police responded to that fear by establishing the Missing Persons Task Force known as Operation Trace. They officially named 6 cases as their focus. However, former investigators and web sleuths unofficially speculate that many more cases are linked under the umbrella of the Vanishing Triangle. The special unit was the brainchild of the Commissioner Pat Byrne, and the Assistant Commissioner Tony Hickey was placed at the helm. Because many of those who vanished were never recovered, investigators had a difficult time linking the cases. There were some similarities in victimology, as all of those who disappeared were young to middle-aged women who vanished suddenly from the eastern part of Ireland. The cases of McCarrick, Dullard, and Jacob remained cold. Despite intensive investigation and media scrutiny, officials failed to come up with evidence, recover remains, or locate suspects. However, there was some traction in the cases of Pender, Sinnott, and Breen. Unofficially, it's believed that the perpetrators of these disappearances were known to their victims and may be unconnected. In 2005, the National Bureau of Criminal Investigations uncovered information on the Fiona Sinnott case. They had acquired an advanced system known as VICLAS, short for Violent Crime Linkage Analysis System, which cross-checked inquiries in multiple violent and serious crimes. This system led to the arrests of 2 men and 3 women with close ties to the Sinnott family. However, they were later released. Strangely, the case of Ciara Breen received renewed media attention in 2010 when retired Detective Inspector Pat Maury announced that he had previously received 2 anonymous letters directing officials to speak to a man who was already their prime suspect. It's believed that these letters implicated Liam Mullen, who on his second arrest was tearful in the interrogation room, close to breaking when his appointed counsel arrived and interrupted the interview. As mentioned previously, ᴘᴛ would later overdose in police custody. In 2015, multiple digs were conducted nearby, one of which unearthed clothing that may have belonged to Breen. Similarly, officials believe Fiona Pender was disappeared by a man who knew her family and was living in the Midlands in the 1990s. Investigators have been unable to secure evidence supporting their suspicions. Although Operation Trace has since disbanded, cold case investigators continue to respond to tips they believe may be credible, executing searches in rural areas with drones, cadaver dogs, and ground-penetrating radar. Many former investigators have been vocal with the media, requesting additional resources and cold case detectives to help crack these cases. The following are potential suspects in the cases of the Vanishing Triangle. Robert Howard has never been officially named as a person of interest in the Vanishing Triangle cases. However, many reporters and amateur investigators have noted his presence in the area, history of abductions, and violent temperament. One journalist claims he is the personification of evil in Ireland. Howard's life of crime began when he was convicted of burglary as a 13-year-old boy. When he was 19, he was convicted of assaulting a toddler pretending to be a doctor. As a result, he was sentenced to just 9 days in an institution. He later married, and local officers and neighbors knew him as a domestic abuser. As a young adult, he was convicted of numerous assaults and robberies, preying on female victims. He graduated to multiple kidnappings, holding his female victims hostage for days. In multiple cases, victims were too traumatized to testify or too fearful to provide evidence which would lead to a substantial conviction. At the time, there was no offender registry, so he was able to easily relocate to separate jurisdictions and seek out new victims relatively unimpeded. Howard has a long sordid history of assaulting young women in Ireland in the mid-1990s, and he was the last person seen with several teenagers before their disappearances. During this time, Howard began referring to himself as the Wolf Hill Werewolf. He was known to be in the area when Annie McCarrick and Jo Dullard disappeared. He was officially investigated by members of Operation Trace, who determined that there was no definitive connection between Howard and these disappearances. He often sought to befriend an older relative of the family before targeting his victims. Reporter Jilly Beatty claims to have multiple sources, some former investigators, who would stake their life savings on the fact that Howard is involved in some or all of these cases. In 2003, he was tried and convicted of the assault and murder of Hannah Williams, a 15-year-old schoolgirl. He was sentenced to life in prison, and he died there in 2015 of natural causes. As previously mentioned, John Crerar attacked and murdered Phyllis Murphy in 1979. Initially, he was a prime suspect, but officials couldn't convict him until 2002 as a result of advancements in DNA technology. Forensic psychologists have suggested that Crerar was not likely to have stopped on his own, and many have speculated that Crerar spent his additional 23 years as a free man targeting additional women in the Irish Midlands. During the investigation, several other allegations of abuse and assault were uncovered. Multiple girls between the ages of 10 and 15 provided statements to officials and reporters about repeated and vicious abuse. Crerar reportedly threatened his victims, offered them money, and discredited their reputation to keep their allegations quiet. However, officials could find no evidence, and no charges were brought against him for these allegations. In the 1990s, Crerar had a reputation. Locals knew him as someone who was quick to accost women and children in passing. At the time, he worked as a guard at a horse ranch which abutted a disused quarry. One woman went on record stating that she saw Crerar frequently entering and exiting the quarry, and on several occasions, she reported seeing him digging there and igniting large burn piles. On the night of Jo Dullard's disappearance, this witness saw Crerar's vehicle outside the entrance gate of the quarry. Another witness claimed to have heard screams coming from the quarry on the night of Deirdre Jacob's disappearance. Living in a rural area, she supposed it could have been wildlife. However, weeks later, she noticed a terrible stench coming from the area. One reporter claims that a witness saw Crerar arguing with a young man in the disused quarry late one night. This witness claims that the second man was the Beast of ᴘᴘᴏᴛ, also known as Larry Murphy. Larry Murphy was a carpenter who lived in the area of multiple victims during the time of their disappearances. He did not have a criminal record at the time, but in 2000 he was convicted of kidnapping and assault. He had been stalking a woman in the area, and he abducted her from the street, forcing her into the trunk of his vehicle and absconding with her. He drove her to a place in the Wicklow Mountains. Two hunters happened upon him strangling and assaulting the victim. Officers reported that Murphy was disturbingly calm during capture and court proceedings. Murphy's conviction brought a 15-year sentence, but he would only serve 10 years. During his time in prison, investigators from Operation Trace found commonalities in the cases of Annie McCarrick, Jo Dullard, and Deirdre Jacob, linking them to Murphy. Furthermore, there are additional connections in the case of Deirdre Jacob. Invoices and receipts indicate that Murphy was in Newbridge at the time of her disappearance, conducting carpentry work at a dance club. Murphy's contact information was found among Jacob's grandmother's possessions after she died of natural causes. It was determined that he had visited her shop with an opportunity to sell wooden toys that he was producing. When CCTV footage of Deirdre Jacob was digitized in 2017, investigators began pursuing new leads. They believed Murphy was captured in the footage too, and they sent tapes along with his picture for forensic analysis. The results were deemed compelling yet inconclusive. Lastly, a fellow prisoner who was close with Murphy claimed that he had confessed when the two got drunk behind bars. Some of the details divulged by Murphy overlapped with details a psychic had given them about the case. However, these details were not released to the public. Murphy was released after serving just 10 years of his sentence. The nation was incensed, and Murphy fled to Holland, Spain, then Amsterdam in the following years. It's believed that he currently resides in London. Despite connections with these unofficial suspects, almost all of the cases profiled here remain unsolved, and these disappearances continue to haunt the nation of Ireland. Many of these women disappeared without a trace, some from the driveways of their own homes, and many of those who remain within the Vanishing Triangle are terrified by the thought of one or more active serial killers prowling the Midlands, waiting for their next victim.